First, I'm not a professor, so from this point of view, I'm not spoiled talking to the young audience. And when you have these young audiences, you really enjoy it. Secondly, the book which we're talking about is going to be published in 4 days. And I really want to use this opportunity in order to present some of the argument, much more to try to provoke you, because you have an experience which is interesting for me. Because many people who write about the protests are fascinated. They fall in love with the people on the street. And my idea was that probably it makes sense also for semi-democratic or unhappy democratic country. On election day, it was a big rain, and almost till 4 o'clock, nobody went to vote to the ballot boxes. And then people, one by one, started going voting. Everything looked like normal. The opposition expected to win. The government expected to survive. But when they started basically seeing the results, they were surprised that 70% of the people voted with a blank votes. It was these white papers which you were putting there. And everybody was shocked. Because if people don't care, why they want to vote in the rain first? Secondly, if they really don't like the government, why they didn't vote for the opposition? And if they don't like both the government and the opposition, why they didn't go on the street? What's happening? And secondly, how it came up that 70% of the people voted this way? So the government immediately started investigation to try to see how this conspiracy was organized. And here came the second surprise. Nevertheless, that there was informers, nevertheless, that there was interrogation, it appeared that there is no traces of organization. It looks like a miracle. It looks that 70% of the population at one and the same moment came with the same idea. The government didn't know what to do, so basically they asked for the elections to be repeated, and then 83% of the people voted with the blank ballots. I'm saying this because this type of a protests, of a blank ballots, this type of a metaphor for something that is happening, people who do not have organization, do not elect a leader, and do not have a very concrete demands in something that we can see in different parts of the world. For the last 5 years, in the period which basically, in my view, started with Occupy Wall Street and ends with Occupy Crimea, for these 5 years, there was a mass political movement in 70 countries of the world. And what is strange, these are very different countries. Okay. There are some authoritarian countries like Russia where there was a movement, there was Egypt, there was the Arab Spring countries, but also you can see a lot of protests taking place in democracies. In Europe, of course, this was the Indignados in Spain, but you have in my own country, Bulgaria, you have Romania, it's almost everywhere. And even economically, you expect that it's going to be only in a very much economically depressed places like Greece or Portugal that have been very much hit by the economic crisis. And then, strangely enough, you end up with protests in places like Turkey that have been growing very fast for the last 5 or 6 years, or even places like Brazil, where even the social inequality was going down. So the problem is, why everywhere? Is this like a strange type of epidemics? Is it like a flu? And if it is a flu, what is behind this? So this was some of the questions that I was very much interested in. And for me, what was also very interesting about these protests, and of course they're different from country to countries, but the most common thing which makes them very different from a previous type of a protest that we know is that in many of these places they have not been organized neither by major political parties, nor by trade unions. People not simply came on their own, but people were highly mistrustful to the established political parties and to the trade unions. This was a movement of mistrust. In a certain way, people not simply were not organized by the political parties, but they didn't allow politicians even to speak on this type of rallies. From this point of view, by the way, Ukraine is a much more middle case. But let's give you the case of my own country, Bulgaria, where for 300 days, people have been marching on the street, and they didn't allow a single political speech. Yeah, sorry. You were so nice, I had the feeling that you were hearing. So basically, for 300 days, people were marching on the street, and there was not a single political speech being given. They didn't allow anybody to speak on behalf of them. So there was a participation without representation, which I find absolutely fascinating. And you can see this in other places too. In the case of Russia, if you remember, during the protests, through the internet, they have been electing who is going to have the right to speak on the rally. And this is new. The second what is new was a very clear lack of ideological profile of the protests. Listen, years ago, 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, when you have a revolution, you always know whose revolution it is. People didn't go to sleep before knowing, is it a communist revolution or fascist revolution or Islamic revolution like in Iran in 1979? If you see how we are calling our revolutions these days, they don't have ideological name. They have a company names, Facebook, Twitter, and this is also very strange. Is it possible to have a major political change without a project? So there was some of the things which comes to me, and of course many people have been comparing with 1968, and there are many things in common. By the way, this type of a libertarian anti-institutional ethos is very much there, and Paul Berman, who is here, has been writing a great book on the 1968. But do you know what is the difference? 1968, at least in the countries which I know better, was a revolt of sociology students in a way. They have been totally preoccupied with the system. They're going to read all these theory books. They're going to discuss what is the system, Marx, Mao, Marcuse, but this was a very strong kind of theoretical interest to understand how the system works. Now, if it is a protest of students, it was much more the protest of psychology students. They were very much about how they're feeling about the system. There was not very much being interested in a certain way how the machine works or does not work. And I find this quite interesting because one of the most important sources of legitimacy of these movements in the words of the people that have been participating was spontaneity. We are spontaneous. We came here on our own. Nobody brought us. I'm saying this, it was so important that when the government decided that they tried to discredit these protests, one of the major arguments of all these different governments, Russia, Turkey, Bulgaria here, was no, they're not spontaneous. There are oligarchs behind them, their money. Everybody tries to basically convince those who are not on the street that people on the street did not come on their own. So I'm saying all this because the third question which I want to ask was how successful these protests were. When you talk to the people, they're going to tell you, and because you're just coming from such a protest, I can imagine basically also being one of the classical answers that you can get on these questions, that everything has changed, that you have been very much transformed by experience. Yesterday, I have been talking to one of your professors who is in political science and political philosophy, and he told me something which was really extremely interesting. He said, before the protest, when I was teaching Heidegger and some of the other philosophers, I have the feeling that my students did not have the experience to understand the text. And what happened after the protests was that now something changed and they started to understand these texts that was not understandable to them before. But if you go beyond this type of a personal transformation of the protests, let's see how successful they have been. Occupy Wall Street, important political fashion. There was a moment in which everybody was talking about it. What has remained, basically, in American politics? Not much. Some are going to say that, of course, Occupy Wall Street succeeded to make Americans much more aware about social inequality issues. But beyond it, it didn't manage to come with the political leaders that we know, and it didn't manage much to affect the politics of the major parties in the United States. If you go with the Arab Spring, it's not simply that the revolution has been defeated. In Egypt, some of the liberals that have been on the street against the army, at the end of the day, basically ended up celebrating the coup of this same army against the Islamists. If you go to Russia, basically what started as Occupy Abai ended as Occupy Crimea. I had the possibility to quote this yesterday, but according to the latest political polling data, support for Mr. Putin now is higher in the places which have been protesting against him 2 years ago. He had now incredibly high support in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg, where the protest was strongest. And I'm saying, oh, and Turkey. Listen, Turkey, people have been on the street. This was an incredibly powerful performance. There was this guy who for 8 hours stayed on the street, just standing there, not talking anything, not moving, sending the message, I'm here and I'm going to be here anytime when I want to defend my interests. But then we had the elections, and on these elections, Mr. Erdogan, he had been powerfully re-elected. So where is the problem with this political protest that changed everything and in a certain way changed nothing? And here is the kind of two questions that I have been very much touching in the book and which I want to very briefly to discuss with you. The first question is why in places like Russia, people decided to go on the street. I'm saying this because many political scientists, me included, we have came with a very elegant theory why the Russians are not going to protest. Just before they went on the street, we had a good explanation why they will not go. And the explanation was the following. Mr. Putin has created a system which was very non-ideological in the way it was presented to the public. So first, the protesters didn't have a language on which to attack the power because the power was claiming nothing. You're telling you're corrupt, and they said, yes, we are corrupt. So you have a power which was basically has only one message to the people, and the message is, we are in power. And nothing has changed. The major ideology of the Putin's regime was, there is no alternative. You can like it or dislike it, but we are like nature. And secondly, you have these open borders. So people who don't like the Russian regime, they should make a choice. To hope to change Russia, knowing how difficult it is to make, for example, Russia like Germany, or simply to go to Germany. And as you can imagine, most of the people did, which was easier. Simply they went to Germany. So strangely enough, there was no need for Mr. Putin to send anybody to Siberia because everybody who disliked him anyway went to London. So at this very moment when we decided that we know why nothing is happening in Russia, it happened. And this is one, in my view, very important personal observation when I have been going with this literature and I was in Moscow. You cannot explain this protest so much through a major socioeconomic structural factors in these countries. There was always something small, and it was very much about people feeling morally or aesthetically offended. It is not even simply that Mr. Putin decided to return to the presidency. It was very much the way he did it. Listen, he even didn't make an effort to convince people that it matters how they feel about it. He went to Medvedev and said, listen, we had a talk with President Medvedev yesterday night. It was an interesting conversation, and we decided I'm going to be back in the presidency and he's going to be prime minister. Not that Russians expected Putin not to go back, but this aesthetic element, this offense, this is, in my view, very important for the middle class protest, because even when middle classes know that effectively they don't matter much in politics, they don't want brutally to be reminded of this. And all the Russian political system was based on fraudulent elections which are not protested. Because people knew that if the elections were free and fair, Mr. Putin most probably are going to be elected anyway. I'm saying this because for me, the most important answer to the question why people went on the street first was this type of a triggering. It's not about interest. This is why all this story about dignity are coming so much in these protests. Something very important about the social status of the persons has been touched. By the way the governments are treating them, their self-respect as a free middle-class citizens was destroyed. Because you cannot be middle-class and treat it like this. And the second is the social media. As you know, a lot of people have been written long books about how social media has made this protest possible, Facebook and Kontakte and all this. I do believe it's very important, but probably it's very important in a slightly different way than people are discussing it. The first, you had the message that because of the social media, people learn how bad the government is. I don't believe that you need Facebook to know that Mr. Yanukovych is corrupt. And this was the same with Mr. Putin. He's there for 14 years. People knew this. And it's not even about the easiest way to self-organize, but the important thing that happens in Facebook is that because of the fact that they have 5,000 friends of yours, you know some, you don't know others, but strangely enough, when they start changing their views, you have the feeling that you're a majority. Imagined majorities is what brings people on the street. People go on the street when they believe that they're a majority. In some countries, they are majorities. Here, it happened that you're a majority. In other places like Russia and Turkey, they were not majorities. But because of it, because it's not just your friends, and the most important in the Facebook is when people who you don't expect to share your position start to share your position. When you see next to you the person whom you don't expect to be there. And I do believe this was a very important mechanism explaining why, I'm going to call them a much more high-risk countries, people decided to go. And from this point of view, of course, their going ended in a regime change, which many people didn't notice. The truth is that Mr. Putin remained the president of the Russian Federation, but the regime has changed. Yulia Ioffe, who is here for our conference, she wrote a beautiful article on how the Russian government reacted to the protest. She had an interview with a senior figure in the Russian State Duma and asked him, how surprising was this protest for you? And the guy said, do you have a pet? And she said, yes, I had a cat. So he said, imagine that your cat starts talking. And this was very important. And by the way, first the middle class was offended, and then Mr. Putin was offended. Because it was his middle class. This was people whom he knows, people he believes he has created. And as a result of it, you ended up with this cultural war, which is now going on a European scale, where he basically looked at these people and said, this could not be real, this middle class, it's not the middle class, this are gay and lesbians, all of them. And from this point, you start to develop a cultural polarization, which is very much based on traditional Russia. Because don't forget, all this talk about gays and lesbians is also a discourse of exclusion. People of you who have been studying the prison experiences know that in prison, if you basically want to exclude somebody, to humiliate him, you go with basically raping and getting him out. This was the rape of Mr. Putin on the Russian middle class. You are not part of the nation anymore. I'm saying this because this is how it worked in an authoritarian environment. But then comes a much more interesting question. Why people go on the street in the countries in which we suppose that we have free and fair elections, where you have a competitive political system? Why the elections are not solving problems? And I'm going to give you some Bulgarian example because coming from a small country, I feel kind of patriotically obliged to tell something about it. For those who have not been on the Bulgarian Black Sea, Bulgaria is a small place and a very particular place from this point of view. In the 1980s, a famous Italian movie director came to Bulgaria. And then we have created one of these 6-hour-long epic movie about the beginning of the Bulgarian state. So we forced him to watch the movie and said, what does he think? He said, it's a small and quiet country. Why are you not making small and quiet films? The problem is that in the last 25 years, we were not making small and quiet films. For the last 25 years after the end of communism, not a single government has been ever re-elected in Bulgaria. Secondly, in the last 12 years, twice, newly formed party won the elections. First was the king. King came, created a party, won the elections. And after that, he lost. But the head of the personal security of the king, the bodyguard of the king, he created a party and he won the elections. So as a result of it, Bulgaria has been governed from the left, from the right, from above, from below, from everywhere. New parties are easily to be formed. Why you go on a protest in a country where it's so easy to change the government and so easy to come with a new party? From the political science point of view, this is a difficult question because normally you believe that protest comes when some other type of political representation basically are blocked. And here is, because I don't want to go long, but here is 4 arguments which I want to give to you why in the democratic countries we're seeing more and more of protests. One is, and this is very typical also for the EU, that people had the feeling that you are changing the government, but you are not changing the policies much. Because the governments all the time are claiming, it's not us. When it comes to economic policy, for example, in the European Union, now we are constitutionalizing the budget deficits and other important policies. So the government is saying, listen, we want something different, but there is no alternative. So from this point of view, the difference is that if in Russia there is no political alternative, in the EU the message is that there is no policy alternative. So from this point of view, the elections started to lose their attraction for the people. People don't believe that they're making major choices. They're not choosing anymore, they're picking up. And from this point of view, when the elections started to lose this type of power of them, several things starts to happen. First, those social groups that you expect to be most interested in voting, I mean poor, unemployed, uneducated, through which basically the political system should help them, this is exactly the groups who are less and less inclined to vote. Secondly, even winning the elections does not mean much, because it happened that before, the relations between the party or the government and the voters were like a Catholic marriage. You're married and you're staying together at least for 4 years. Now, basically, it's a free love. In France, Mr. Hollande lost his support probably 10 weeks after he was elected. So from this point of view, elections are starting to lose their importance both for the voters, but also for those in government, because they are not making it easier for you to govern. The second thing that happened with the elections, and it was very interesting during the Bosnian protests, where one of the Bosnian protesters told me, listen, the most difficult decision for us was where exactly to protest, because we have 3 different governments. We have the federal government, and we have the canton, and we have the local, and we wanted to burn a governmental building, but how to decide which? And this is very important, because if before the governments were very much trying to pretend that they're more powerful than they were, now the strategy of governments is very much to pretend that they're more weaker than they are. Just to make life funnier, but when I was a student, I used to have a friend who was extremely successful with girls in the class. And his success was based on the fact that he was claiming all the time that he's impotent. So basically, all the girls he approaches felt it as a miracle that he was doing this with them. So he became highly successful. This is what the governments are doing these days. You have the governments who said, I cannot promise you anything. Listen, don't expect anything. Reducing expectations became the major story. It's not up to me. So basically, governments don't want to be respected anymore. They want it to be pitied. How difficult it is, these guys, how they're doing this and so on. And I do believe this is very difficult to decide how to protest and how to influence a government which basically plays its weakness. So this is why when you go on the street, you basically try to challenge the whole of the political system. You say, we don't know where the power is, but we want to face the power. The third, of course, is the oligarchical term. This is true in many countries. It was very clear in Bulgaria. But you have the feeling that we're voting for the politicians, but it is the businesses behind them. And you can change a government, but we are not changing the oligarchs who are running this government. And of course, I do believe that you know this in this country. And then how you're protesting against the oligarchical regime. Normally, democracy says we have not simply political competition, but we have separation of power. But in order to have a separation of power, you assume that, for example, judicial power is not dependent on the government. But if you have oligarchical power, the same oligarch who has bought the government has bought also the judicial power. So how you're protesting in a case like this? And strangely enough, in the case of oligarchical rule, the street is the only effective way of protest, because you cannot buy the street. It's a very small retail. And basically, oligarchs are in a much more kind of a corporate buying. But here, and this is my last point, why this type of also very inspiring movements happen to be not effective enough? And I do believe that part of the strengths of these movements come from the fact that they basically was anti-institutional, being spontaneous, and so on. But the major story of the people was yeah, we don't want to be cheated. Mistrust was at the heart of this protest movement. This is why they didn't have leaders. We don't want leaders, not simply because it's easier these days to communicate between ourselves, but because we have learned that leaders are always cheating us. So the only way not to be cheated is to be totally mistrustful. And here comes the turn. And here's the bad part of the story on which I want to finish. If in the first moment the governments are very much shocked by the protests, then they realized that playing mistrust is their game. And then the government stops saying, trust us. They start saying, don't trust anybody. And when you have the governments that played exhaustion, waiting for the people to protest, especially if they're peaceful protests and so on, and when they start totally discrediting and just increasing the natural mistrust of the protest movements, this government always succeeds. Because at the moment you don't have a representation, you can prevent something from the street, but you cannot change much. Only governments who decided to show power, to crash, to confirm in their eyes that they basically control the situation, and I do believe this was Mr. Yanukovych's position, they are then in risk. And I'm saying this because this is the paradoxical story with these very inspiring movements. Being very much composed of a generation that is mistrustful to political institutions, to political leaders, to political process in general, you ended up with movements who are either very successful when they ask for something very small, for example, not to build a railway station somewhere in Germany, or basically to decrease the bus tickets in Brazil, or they ask for something very big like the end of capitalism in the United States, but the real one, the political, is totally missing. And I want to stop here because in a certain way, this is also the question that probably I have for you. How are you going to know how successful your protest, your revolution was? This is a major difference. And by the way, I do believe it has something to do with the generally not very much violent nature of these protests. As you know, in English language, the same verb is used for shooting from gun and shooting with camera. And protest is very much about shooting. But people these days started much more shooting with their iPhones. In a certain way, if you see how the political dynamics of the process have been sustained, this was very much by taking pictures. And this is also a very important difference between these protests and 68. It's not so much the readers. It's much more visual. It's very much about images. And from this point of view, this power is the power to produce a moral outrage that should change the situation. This is why the governments risk so much with violence. Because we have been discussing with colleagues when the protests started here. And I was very much influenced by the Bulgarian protests. So I said, if Mr. Yanukovych is not going to be advised to crash the protests, most probably he'll survive. Because in a certain way, all these protests, people are staying, but the moment when the government decided to use violence is when you understand that it's a different government. This is when the government loses also its democratic legitimacy based on elections. Because in a strange way, people can live with the fact that their government is corrupt, but with the fact that their government is violent, this is a different story. And also violence started to have a much higher cost because these images go internationally, and then the public starts to put pressure on the governments of other countries, and basically the governments of other countries start to press on your own government. This is very interesting. By the way, this has a lot to do with the changes in the international order. Don't forget, international orders normally are composed based on the idea to prevent revolution. Look at the 1815. Napoleon, and then basically you end with the order of the 19th century. This is basically an agreement of the elites. We are not going to allow revolutions. Basically, we're going collectively to respond to any type of revolutionary movement. Even with the Cold War, basically everybody is going to control the revolution in his own sphere of influence. Now, because of these iPhones, iPads, because of this circulation of images, because images are decontextual. You don't need to know anything about Ukraine. in order to be totally outraged by a policeman being student. You don't need a context. It's about our human nature. You don't want the power to be people. And from this point of view, create a constituency which is becoming transnational and, of course, starting to exercise very strong power because governments try to be highly moralizing when it's not about them. And I do believe from this point of view, you have this type of a situation which have a difference. But the other thing on the other side, what was lost is that when before you have the voter as a very critical figure in our democracy, part of the power of the voter was not simply that he can go with a ballot and put his ballot there, but it was very much that he has other roles in society which were very important. He was a worker, he was a consumer, he was a soldier. And all these three were making him very important for the elites because you want the soldier to defend you. And in a certain way, it's very much the worker and the consumer that are making economy going. What has happened in our society is that our elites less and less depends on the local voters because, listen, the workers these days, they're in China, so you don't need to work there. And when it comes to consuming, it's not very much dependent on the government. And also when it comes even to fighting, in countries, especially in the highly technology countries, basically you expect that the next generation of soldiers are going to be robots anyway. This is why you have a citizen which are freer than before, but less powerful. And nevertheless, the democratic institution exists. This citizen has lost the social sources of his power. I don't know how clear I was, but at least this is my feeling. Yeah. This is a very radical leftist reading of what I said, because I'm going to give you a story about direct democracy too. Normally, people form their views also based on the television that they watch. And most of these televisions are owned by the same oligarchs. So I told you one novel in the beginning. Let's give you one Romanian science fiction short story. This is about a political regime which decided to go beyond representation. So when they elect a president, at the day of the elections, the guy who has won, they are putting a special bomb in his body. And every voter has a small device. And every decision that the president is taking, you should say yes or no. And if the majority of the people say no, the guy is exploding. And this is a kind of a version of a direct democracy because you believe that if you have a bomb implanted in yourself, you're going to be responsive to the people's needs. The only problem is to what extent this is a democracy. And this is part of the problem because direct democracy is something extremely attractive, and I do believe that we're going to see much more of it because also, of course, technologically with the social media, you have this. But the interesting story about direct democracy is also this is how much is interested and who is interested. Could we force everybody to be interested? And honestly speaking, any type of event like the protests also polarizes society. Mr. Erdogan also benefited from the protests because it appeared that the protesters were millions on the street of Turkey, but there was other millions who were there and who didn't like the protests. And in a certain way, what you see in Donetsk is a very similar story. From this point of view, the idea that there is just the people, and because of the idea of the justice, these differentiated people are going to govern. That they are not going to be politics on the basis of difference between ideologies, people much more on the left and people who have a different views on the right. That you're going to have these homogeneous people who are going to decide. This idea of hating, the idea of the interest in politics, this I find also kind of a very misleading, because representation has a lot of problems. But representations create an institutions that can create a kind of a much more effective and long-lasting reforms. The world of direct democracy is world without reformism. You're going to have a direction, and by the way, what we are saying these days, we have a different process. More and more, politicians are becoming the managers of the present. They're not coming with any big visions of the future, they don't have a project and so on, and they're allowing the people to say no. What we can do these days, we can prevent many things. By the way, the Bulgarian protest, which was very much aroused by a guy, oligarchs, but also one of those oligarchs that even does not exist in the bad movies. Because the guy was ugly, fat, young. His mother controls 70% of the media in the country. And He was 33 years old, and they decided to elect him the head of the counterintelligence in charge of corruption. Why they did it, I never will understand, but it happens. And people stopped it. For 48 hours, 100,000 people on the street, the guy was not elected. The problem is, does anything change in the counterintelligence? And here comes the problem with the oligarchs, and I do believe this is an interesting story. And if there is something for which you really should hate Mr. Putin is that by occupying Crimea, he in a certain way killed the anti-oligarchical part of your revolution. Because now the story is how you're keeping the territorial integrity of this and that, and they're going to be the patriotic oligarchs that are coming up to save the country. So it's much more difficult in this situation to basically say he's an oligarch. He's not an oligarch anymore. He's simply a very rich, good Ukrainian. But this is part of it. And I do believe from this point of view, I don't believe that the street is totally helpless with respect to oligarchical power. In a certain way, I do believe that it is the very emergence of the streets that are telling us what has happened to some of our democracies, not everywhere. But it's a trade-offs. Interesting story. Why the oligarchs became so important? If you go, I know basically, let's give you Bulgaria, 1990. You have less influence of money on politics, not simply because there were less money, but simply because people have been much more active politically. And when people are active politically, for example, you're not paying anybody to go with your leaflets because they're activists. And also the politics was perceived as a dignified thing. And as a result of it, you go there, and some of the best people of the nation have been very much interested to enter politics. The power of the oligarchs is very closely related and correlating with a disgust for politics. If you believe that only crooks can go to politics, you ended up with politics which is populated with crooks only. If you basically there is no volunteers to go with basically the leaflets, the political party should pay for somebody to go with the leaflets. And when you should pay, you should go to the people with money. And when you go to the people with money, they have an idea how to be governed the country. I do believe that, strangely enough, it was the very much strong distaste for the politics, and especially for party politics, which helped oligarchs a lot. Honestly speaking, Ukraine always, for me, was an extreme case. I remember years ago, being here and tried to enter the parliament, and there was this very nice lady who was giving this the permission, and I was going to meet somebody from one of the political parties, and she was telling to her colleague, there is somebody who should meet, and it doesn't matter. She didn't say the name of the party, she said the name of the company. And the fact that you have the representation of the companies is a problem. But on the other side, this is good about protests, because nevertheless, how rich you are, when you have 100,000 people on the street, you are not feeling secure anymore, because you cannot negotiate with everybody. You cannot buy everybody. In a certain way, this is, strangely enough, the high level of insecurity and chaos is very much also constraining the oligarchs' power. And probably one of the good things about the protest is that it re-injects something which is very important in my view in democratic politics, and this is elites' fear of the people. Thank you very much. First, I want very much to thank people at the end whom I understand that they're hearing nothing, and they have been so silent and nice to me. Probably what you're imagining that I'm saying is much more interesting than what I said anyway. Going with Stiglitz, I do believe that the interesting stories, I do believe that institutions matters. And I do believe that one of the major changes that happened in democracy was that before you have on the street people who have been outside of institutions that want to enter institutions in order to influence them. The classical story, for example, blacks in the United States in the 1960s. We are on the street because the institutions are closed for us. And I remember, I don't remember whom of the leaders of the 68 used to say that the protest is the voice of the unheard. But I very much, and this is, I don't want to go more theoretical than this, but in the book I was talking very much about this distinction between voice and exit, which Hirschman is developing. And I was asking the question, to what extent these protests are exercise of voice, and to what extent it is much more kind of a sophisticated exercise in exit. And let's give you an example. During the Rome time, there was several kind of political events which normally are called secessions. This is when the plebs is totally pissed off with the way the system functions. They do believe that their view is totally neglected. And do you know what? They don't organize a conspiracy. They don't go for an uprising. All people are leaving the city. They go in one of the neighboring hills. And they're waiting for the senators to come and to give them a story, basically to reconstitute the political community. I do believe this is very important because in a certain way, how I'm reading these protests are very much people coming on the street with one very simple message: the sovereign exists. And this is the strange part of it. Listen, most of the weakness and the strength of this movement is based in one thing. They're very legitimate in the eyes of everybody, exactly because on the streets is everybody. Far left, far right, staying next to each other, everybody said it cannot be, but this is why these people can claim that they're the people. But exactly because everybody is there, you cannot have a project, you cannot have a program in a classical political sense, and this is why basically the street stopped to exist at the moment when the real politics comes. And I do believe this source of legitimacy and the fact that source of ineffectiveness is the same time, this is why my push is why none of these protests, or very few of them, ended in a strong political party. Have you noticed that in the countries in which you have a new parties in Europe, is the countries in which the protests were weak? I'm talking about the classical protest party. For example, Five-Star Movement in Italy. You ended up with a political party, and on the other side you have the protests in Spain. Two countries, kind of a very different way of expressing their, in a certain way, expressing their preferences. For me, it was always easy to compare and to try to see who managed to have more impact on its system. By the way, a party which is going to fall apart. But this party which is going to fall apart, the Five-Star Movement, managed to push for much more changes than the indignado people that have been on the street and said, we don't want representation, we don't want to be cheated. My idea is better to be cheated than not believing in anything. Listen, with violence is extremely interesting. By the way, let's start with why some of these protests, because comparing with 1968, in 1968, there was a major part of the protest movements that believe in the transformative power of violence. And of course, in the 1970s, you can see these people in Italy, in West Germany, basically in the radical wing. You're not going to see this here. And there was, of course, first, because we know how it ended in the 1970s, so people are learning certain things. But second is because when you go for violence, the very idea of the leaderless revolution is not functioning anymore. Look at your own experience. What happened when basically the Maidan started violently to clash with power? Then you need organization. You need 100 people. These 100 persons units has a commanders. These commanders has other commanders. In a certain way, the war is not something that can be tweeted. You need organization. And from this point of view, when you have an ethos of people who fear organization and institutions, you have a kind of an inborn reluctance to go to this type of a much more born clashes. Why governments call for violence? Listen, of course, every case of this is very different. In the case of Russia, by the way, this is very interesting because Mr. Putin did not do what Mr. Yanukovych did. If all the protests in Russia, by the way, have been legal, in Moscow, there was a lot of violence in the countryside, but it's nothing new. He started violence after he politically crashed them, after May 6. He didn't start with any type of a major police violence before he was re-elected. It was on the basis of his new legitimacy, he started Bolotnaya Delo and all this type of a pressure. Because for him it was quite important to show that first he politically defeated his opponents and then he's going to destroy them. The problem with Mr. Yanukovych was that he cannot politically defeat his opponents because in a certain way he was weak. And this is the problem. Violence is a very bad instrument in the hands of a weak government. Because when you decide to go violent, it reveals your weakness. Because in a certain way, when governments, there was a lot of, by the way, empirical studies showing what is the effect of using violence, not using violence. The easiest groups which use violence, governments, is either governments which have a very strong ideological legitimacy, basically us versus them, or ethnic background, Assad, because you always believe that somebody is going to be on your side. Because when you ask the police to go to the street, police should decide, is it going to do it for you? And it's never about how big the salary is. It's also basically look around and say, is people going to be on your side? How it's going to end up? If all this turns back, you start to have all these officers who are not highly interested to follow commands. And from this point of view, the very weakness of government is very much coming up in this moment. And this is why I do believe that the worst advice that somebody can give to a weak president is to try by violence to quash the protests. Thank you very much. It's a great question. And first, about experience. There is one central concept, in my view, for this protest movement, and this is the concept of friendship in a political sense. Against the idea of the institutions and organizations, what basically the protests come up is the idea of the friendship, but friendship on the level of society. Imagine a nation as a big kind of a group of friends. And then you have all this informal type of a coordination and doing things. But why the elites in the last decade started to be interested in elections? By the way, this is an interesting story. Let's give you the Russian example. Why Mr. Putin, who can win most probably free and fair elections, at least if not now he probably can again, but in 2004, even most of his biggest enemies are going to suggest that if the elections were free and fair, he was going to win. Why somebody who can win free and fair elections decided to fake them? To go with the rigged elections, and by the way, not simply with the rigged elections, but he's rigging in the way that everybody knows that they're rigged. No, this is very important, because what he's interested in is not the democratic source of his legitimacy, but the authoritarian one. Because listen, it's much easier to manipulate elections than to arrest 100,000 people. The problem of the authoritarian government is to convince the citizens that they cannot do anything, that nothing depends on them. It can be done in one way or the other, but if you manage to convince the people that there is no alternative and nevertheless of what you're doing, nothing can change, you have succeeded. Where is the attraction of democracy for the elites? And this, in my view, is very important. In the democratic system, you can be weak government and legitimate at the same time. Listen, you can have 20% of support. You can be disliked and so on, but you can always refer to your legitimacy. Authoritarian government cannot do it. Authoritarian government either should basically succeed to convince people that they don't have alternative, either to deliver 7, 8, 9% kind of growth like in China, or, to be honest, it should try to go on the level and scale of terror, which is also not easy to be organized and to be sustained. One of the interesting elements of the Crimean annexation from the domestic political point of view of Russia is, if till yesterday Mr. Putin's popularity very much depended on his success to increase the economic well-being of the Russians because of gas and oil, now he does not need it, at least in short term, very much. At the moment when the Russian economy went in recession, he's saying to the people, trust me, not because of the fact that our economy is going to grow, but because I'm the only one who can deliver the glory of the Russian state. And from this point of view, it has a major effect. He basically shifted the sources of his legitimacy, and from this point of view, in a certain way, occupation of Crimea had an incredibly important domestic effect on the domestic Russian politics. Very much agree with you. In a certain way, part of the problem with this type of consensual politics is that you do not have the feeling that the change of the government is going to affect your life. And this is interesting, because the politicians more and more are trying to tell what they're doing as being managers in public interest. This is all this stress on competence. But listen, this is why, in a certain way, I'm not so negative, unlike many others, of the rise, for example, of the radical left or radical right. Because the radical left and the radical right were very important in politics because they're sending you a signal that the political change can make a difference and can make a very big difference. Can make a difference basically how your society functions and what kind of society it is going to be. And because our society has totally lost the potential to fear, to be alarmed. We always believe that everything which is happening, in fact, nothing bad can happen. This is especially true for the European Union. In Bulgaria, we had a very strong, very nasty, to be honest, political party, but nasty in a very trivial way. They hate everybody, but of course they prefer to hate those who are the weakest. Because being against the Roma or this minority is totally helpless, you don't need very heroic position for this. And this party is getting quite a lot of votes. Why people are ready to vote for such type of openly radical alternatives? Because they say, we're in the European Union, nothing really bad can happen. Because of the very fact of the existence of the European Union, the radical alternatives are not so radical. This idea that, and this is the other side of this, I believe in institutions, but I don't believe that institutions are the only thing that matters. The fact that you have the United Nations is not a guarantee that you are not going to have a war, or the fact that you have European Union. The nature of politics, the nature of the actors matter. And strangely enough, part of this, on one level, protesters does not believe in institutions at all. On the other side, especially liberal elites are totally sure that if you have the right institutions, you should not care at all about how people feel and what they want and how it is, because the institutions are so benevolent that they can manage to diffuse any tensions and to fight any type of radicalism. And I do believe that between these two extremes, there is something which is in a certain way also more interesting and lively, and this is politics. And I don't believe that democracy can exist without politics, where people clash their views of the world, also their interests and so on. This more political society are not nicer than others, but I do believe they give us a better chance for self-correction. Because democracy was never about people making the right choices. Democracy about something totally different, allowing people when they make a wrong choice to correct it. Of course, rational choice is a good thing, but it cannot go excessive even with it. And here is part of the interesting story about democracy. Democracy is about representation, but also very much about misrepresentation, and this is part of its positive mystery. For example, when you vote, you have your ballot, and it doesn't matter how important the vote is for you. Imagine that I basically die for Mr. Klitschko to be elected. And you don't care about who is going to be elected. Both of us has one vote. The intensity of the feeling is not represented. Because in a certain way, democracy was about pacifying. It's about getting the emotions out of politics. Protests, and this is why I was so much stressing on the emotional sides, is representation of intensity. When you go on the street, you're not simply saying that, for example, you don't like Mr. Yanukovych. When you went to the street, you said, I don't like Mr. Yanukovych to the extent that I'm going to die for him to leave the country. And this is representation of intensity, which is extremely important, because through a classical rational choice stuff, you cannot understand this turn in politics. And I do believe this is what makes revolution so difficult to be predicted and explained in the classical rational choice theories, because rational choice theory does not need revolutions. And from this point of view, of course, when you're studying protests, and if you believe that protest comes out of the limitation of this type of institutional representation, then probably it makes sense to go and to look what happened with the unrepresented or misrepresented, namely the intensity of the political choice. Thank you very much.